Thank you, Dave, for introducing this perspectives paper that we've been working on, and also the challenges that come from that and how they relate to also today's workshop. And as you could also see in these different challenges, is that not every challenge will be dealt with one by one in the sessions. There will be overlap. So we will also see that some of the topics we will be discussing in this first session will also be coming back later. So I'm now very happy to introduce this first session by saying a little bit more about what we are going to talk about in this first part. So the current frameworks were already mentioned by Paul earlier, and they may not address all the challenges that we deal with if we talk about functional ingredients, because with the functional ingredients, they fall a bit between different categories because they are not an essential nutrient, but how to deal with them specifically. And then in this first session, we will look at that from 3 different perspectives. So first of all, our question is which components should be added? So there are a lot of different components present in breast milk. Breast milk is a very complex system, as already mentioned. So how are we going to deal with that in the context of infant nutrition? So which components do we want to focus on? How important is it that they are also present in human milk, and how similar they are to human milk? So these kind of questions will come now. And we will also talk about variability, with infant formula being focused at a whole age range. But at the same time, we know that infants that are breastfed do receive a different breast milk depending on the age that the infant has. So we see variation in levels, also depending on the diet of the mother. And there are all kinds of reasons that human milk varies a lot. So how do we translate that to infant nutrition? So what levels do we want to add? And then finally, also in what form do we want to add these components? So some components we can produce that are more or less or completely identical to those in human milk. But if we, for example, look at proteins and we would use bovine milk as a starting point, these components are not identical. There may be differences in amino acids, there may be differences in structure, there may be differences in glycosylation. So how similar should components be, and how do we test that in the end? So these are some of the questions that we will deal with in this first session. And as already mentioned at the start of today's workshop, we first had this opinion survey with the panelists, not only the ones which will talk in session 1, but actually all the panelists were involved in answering all these questions. And based on that, there is already also some similarities in answers that we will not discuss that extensively. We'll mostly discuss on the questions where answer differed between the panelists. But if we look at this first point of human milk, now human milk is very complex. It contains a lot of different components, and we are not able to mimic that completely. So there are all kinds of cells that are present in human milk, like immune cells, but also epithelial cells in which milk is being synthesized. And next to that, we have a whole range of components, ranging from the macronutrients, for example, the lactose, the major milk proteins, the micronutrients. But for each of these components, there's another layer of complexity, because we can say, yes, there is protein, but if we look at human milk, there are hundreds of different proteins that are not only there to serve a nutritional purpose of supplying the essential amino acids that are necessary for growth, but also a whole range of hundreds of other proteins that support the infant in its growth. Now, the same can be said, for example, for the human milk oligosaccharides. That's a category, again, consisting of hundreds of individual components. So how are we going to choose which components from human milk to use as a starting point for the design of infant nutrition? And at the bottom, they are called here xenobiotics. In the end, there are also components that may end up in human milk, not because they are synthesized or specifically added to human milk by the mother, but they may come from the environment. That can be pharmaceutical or other components that come from the diet that end up in the human milk. So not every individual human milk component necessarily has to be there for optimal development of the infant. And then next to this variation that we already have in milk composition itself, with all these thousands of individual human milk components, even if we look one level further, there's a lot of variability. I already mentioned that breast milk changes over lactation. So if we look at colostrum versus mature milk here, you get a different amount of fat and protein in this milk, also different amount of functional proteins. I was almost going to say bioactive proteins, but I really try very hard to not do that. So we see that there is variation in human milk composition, and here it's mentioning colostrum and mature milk, but actually there's a whole gradual change, and it doesn't stop once you reach mature milk. If you are at 3 months, at 6 months, or at a year, there is continuous changes all the time happening. So how are we going to incorporate that in the design of infant nutrition? And the examples given here are partly also from a nutritional perspective. So we will not be talking about the essential nutrients today. It's mostly focused on the functional ingredients that we want to add. But lactation stage is only one example. There are all kinds of other reasons that milk composition may change as well. There are genetic differences. Human milk oligosaccharides is a very well-known example of that, where you see that depending on the genetics of the mother, different enzymes are there that support synthesis of the human milk oligosaccharides. So you get already a different pool of human milk oligosaccharides depending on the genetic background of the mother. Then the maternal diet has an impact. Also things that are present in the environment. If we look, for example, at which pathogens the mother encounters, that has an influence on which type of immunoglobulins the mother is secreting in the milk. So there's a whole range of different reasons why human milk shows variability. So that will be the second topic that we will be talking about in today's first session. And then finally, there's also variation on a much more detailed level. So even if we know how much lactoferrin there is in human milk, if we compare that to bovine milk, there's not only a different amount of lactoferrin present, but also the chemical form in which it's present differs. So there are amino acid differences that cause a difference in structure, but also the glycosylation, so the sugars that are attached to the protein structure, differ between these human and animal milk, and that has an impact on the function of that lactoferrin. So if we start adding components that have been extracted from human milk, we have to take that into account. But how do we do that? How do we make sure that a component that we are adding that is not identical to human milk is still appropriate to be added? And then there may also be components that show functionality that is to some extent similar to human milk, but are chemically very different. And an example of that is shown here on the right side. So we have the human milk oligosaccharides that I already mentioned, that amongst others have prebiotic effects. But we can achieve some of these prebiotic effects also by adding GOS and FOS, which are other oligosaccharides, which are chemically completely different from those in human milk. Human milk does not contain these oligosaccharides, but functionally there are some similarities with that. So how do we deal with components that are chemically completely dissimilar, but show some similarities in functionality? So luckily I don't have to answer all these questions today, because I have a panel of people who will help me with that. So we will have a discussion, and I would like to invite them to the stage. Now, the first person I don't have to invite to the stage because she's already present online. You can see her in the top right, which is Lindsay Allen. She's a distinguished research scientist and former director at the USDA ARS, Western Human Nutrition Research Center, and an adjunct professor at UC Davis. She studies prevalence causes and consequences of micronutrient deficiencies, primarily in developing countries. Then the second person I would like to ask to come to the stage is Monkey Ho. She works for Novonesis and is responsible for regulatory submission for a diverse range of ingredients, particularly those in early life nutrition. So please come up to the stage. Then next is Ashley Patterson. She is a team leader in the global nutrition science at Mead Johnson Nutrition, and she works across innovation pipeline from development to implementation and has authored peer-reviewed manuscripts on infant growth and tolerance. And then the third person I would like to call to the stage is Tony Pavel. He's a partner at Keller and Heckman in Washington, D.C., and he guides clients through FDA regulatory matters related to food additives and ingredients, and dietary supplements, and is frequently invited to speak on food ingredients and related policy. And then we were gonna have a fifth panelist, Shelley Maguire, but she's unfortunately unable to be with us today, and we wish her well. And we are grateful for her participation in the pre-workshop surveys on this topic. So now we'll move over. So welcome all. Thanks for being here, but also thanks for joining in the survey before today's session. And I prepared a number of questions, but the objective is that ideally we should try to reach consensus. And what consensus means has already been explained at the start. So what we will be talking about today is to see whether we can come up with a set of criteria for the selection of functional components to be added to infant nutrition, and whether those criteria should be different for components that exist or are similar to human milk components compared to those which do not occur in human milk. The second question we will be dealing with is whether mechanistic understanding of these components is required. So do we really need to understand what this component exactly is doing? And finally, as already mentioned by previous speakers, we have optional ingredients and mandatory ingredients. And the question is, should functional ingredients get a separate category, for example, of recommended next to these existing ones? So that's the purpose of what we are going to discuss today. And I have a number of questions that I first would like to have your opinion on, and then afterwards we will also ask the audience, and we will finish after these first two questions also with a Slido where we try to phrase it even a bit more simple. So first, when it comes to the criteria for inclusion, it was very clear from the survey that safety comes first, but there are other reasons to pursue components to add to human milk. So that can be presence in human milk, that can be preclinical or clinical data, mechanisms of action, observational studies that have been done. So the question is, which of these criteria are the most important to consider a component to be included in formula? So who can I give the word? Who would like to respond to that question?
I think the scientists need to start, and then the lawyers can cause trouble.
Is this okay for everybody? Okay, I think it's on. All right, so from a scientist perspective, I think all those points you've listed, Casper, are important to consider when we decide what are we going to pursue for development as an infant formula ingredient, right? There has to be, a hypothetical reason for why this could be something that is going to help close the compositional gap between formula and infant and human milk. So that would include the presence of the substance in human milk, but that alone shouldn't be enough. You have to have some sort of mechanistic, even if it's a hypothesis at the moment, which is then further supported by preclinical assays that kind of is leading you down the right path of where you think this or what you think this ingredient is going to do, which is then supported by maybe more animal models and then eventually to clinical data. So I think all of those, it's almost like a ladder of progression.
But you mentioned hypothetical understanding, at least, of the mechanism, or actual understanding of the mechanism. How important is understanding what a component is doing?
Yeah, I think our understanding of components are never going to fully stop, right? But there has to be enough of a reason to believe to continue pursuing the development of a certain substance.
I'll just add the note here too, that not in agreement. Oh, sorry. I would add just on that point, we don't want to end up in the pharmaceutical safety standard, but there are lots of pharmaceuticals where the complete mechanism, the pharmacokinetics, are not fully understood as well. So, I think we have to, and to some of Paul's earlier remarks, we have the science, but we also have to have the standard against which we are assessing safety for the inclusion of these ingredients.
And I would agree with both of your statements. I think all the totality of evidence is really important, and that is, a layered development process, right? So you might be starting with an insight, perhaps based on human milk composition, perhaps there is observational evidence that you're drawing on, perhaps there's evidence in a different population, perhaps adults, that you're drawing from, and then you're building that whole kind of package of evidence over time. And realistically, I think we know that can take a very long period of time. It can take kind of decades to build up our understanding, but at some point, like you say, Tony, there, you have enough evidence to say, it seems like there's something here, and we want to pursue evaluating the safety of this component. And even after you've gone through that safety process, the data generation doesn't stop. We continue to build out our understanding of these components over time.
But does that also make a difference depending on whether or not a component does have a human milk analog? Because sometimes, for example, with the example of phosphorus, there's not a human milk analog. So would you follow the same procedure no matter whether the component is present in human milk, or does it make a difference?
I don't feel like the overarching thought process is hugely different. I think collectively as a field, we have a goal of bringing infant formula closer to the functionality that we observe with human milk. So I think you're still kind of walking through the same steps. And, we do have a reality that, perhaps the technology isn't available to create an ingredient that is, 100% identical to what we find in human milk. We're in a situation today where we are isolating components from another source, say bovine milk, or they're being manufactured. And, there has to be a pathway to think through those components. I think, you brought up some good examples as well, like with GOS, FOS, PDX, those kind of oligosaccharide ingredients that we've had in infant formula for quite a substantial period of time now. We have a lot of safety evidence and a lot of evidence that shows that they support outcomes that are similar to those observed in breastfed infants, right? We see improvements in stooling and microbiota composition, and, you know, over time, you know, decades later, then now there are human milk oligosaccharide ingredients, and we're kind of building out our understanding of those. But I think the overarching framework then, if we think about that overarching goal of trying to replicate the functionality of human milk as closely as possible, you're thinking about all of these new components within that overarching goal in a similar framework, I think.
I think that gets to suitability, no? When you're looking at an ingredient, a component that's not in breast milk, we have to get to that next question of the suitability for the use within that formula.
Yeah, I was just going to, Lindsay, please. It's
Yes, good morning. Sorry I can't be there. So I wanted to make comments which are more to do with nutrients, but also in large part applied to functional components as well. I'm mostly a micronutrient scientist, but nutrients in general. So I wanted to bring into perspective a bit this question of human milk as a guide for inclusion of components in. Do we know what's in human milk now? And the answer is not very well, especially for nutrients. And this applies to functional ingredients as well. There are so many of them, as were pointed out, and you need a special kind of study to really know what is in the population's supply. And so you need information on the composition of human milk and also the volume consumed by the infant, which is a measure which is not usually taken, but certainly we have means to do that. So for components such as nutrients, but also functional ingredients, we need to match what's in milk by having a large population of samples. You can't just do this with 20 women, for example, because there's such wide variation in many of these nutrients. And we need information over the first 6 to 9 months of lactation in a rolling manner, so that we have data for every day, week, or whatever over this time. At the moment, the recommended intakes for nutrients, macronutrients, micronutrients, and so on, are based on very poor data, usually only one measurement taken across 6 months in women who were supplemented or not, who didn't know anything about their usual diet and so on. And there's so many nutrients. And so just to promote our own work, but it is an approach which is needed for all of these constituents, is we tried to set up reference values for nutrients and then other components in human milk as well. So large population, rolling data over time, we need the range of usual intakes, we need the volumes consumed at the same time so we can get total intakes by the infant, and then you can get the median intake and percentiles around that, and you add the amount that so that less than 2.5% of the infants consume less than the estimated average requirement. It's a strategy which is not being used, and so at the moment we are have adequate intakes for infants. Many of those are just based on what they think is in human milk, but is actually not the case. Many of the older values were with wrong equipment, with supplemented women, and so on and so forth. So the special problems then are how to deal with supplementation, which is widespread in the United States and will alter what's in milk. The last National Academies report only assumed collected data on US women, so they missed associations between usual intake and what's in milk because of the effect of supplements and so on. And there's a big problem here I just want to mention for discussion later, which is the lack of authoritative bodies making these decisions. This will be important by the end of this meeting. The Food and Nutrition Board now has been moved to under agriculture of the National Academies. WHO is working on this very slowly. It would take 10 years at that before their recommendations for infants come out. EFSA also is another force which I don't think is doing very much on this right now. So even if we come up with these decisions, then who is going to be the authority that sets the recommendations? So I hope this is helpful. I know it isn't just about functional ingredients, but I think that the issue of how you assess what the recommendations are very much comes down to the same questions of having enough data from the population, usual intakes, variability in intake by the infant, not only in concentration, but in milk volume, and so on. So we can discuss these issues further, but I think realizing we don't even know what the correct nutrient recommendations are at this point, I think is a perspective that if we address that, how much of the functional ingredients we need comes under that umbrella as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, we will be also discussing more about levels in a bit later in this session, and I think what is already known from micronutrients here is very useful input for that. So thanks. I also had a bit of a follow-up question about what we were just discussing about these functional ingredients, and that relates a bit to what was said in the introduction, that human milk is a complex system with also synergies amongst components. So we can talk about how we select individual components for addition to infant nutrition, but in the end we also have to deal with that if we compare it to human milk as a starting point, that the human milk components work together, especially if we also talk about understanding the mechanism. This may be another thing we need to take into account. So how do you feel about, let's say, the interaction that there may be amongst components?
Well, I think, you know, as Tony mentioned, you're always kind of bringing it back to like the safety question first, right? So you're kind of thinking about, are there kind of adjacent components to your component of interest that might be important for safety? You know, we see an example of this perhaps with DHA, where there's some evidence that it's important to have, you know, ARA at least the same concentration at DHA and less EPA than DHA to promote age-appropriate growth in certain populations, right? And so there have been kind of, as we've learned over time, you know, additional kind of conditions that have to be in place to add a component like DHA to formula. So I think there's those kinds of considerations, right, that are really foundational to think about. And then, yeah, in terms of functionality, that may be the case as well, right, where you could perhaps see a benefit to providing kind of a collection of components versus a single isolated component. And Yeah, just kind of depends whether you can show kind of some kind of benefit with the component on its own, or whether it's really needed to have something else included as well.
I think synergistic effects are really challenging from a regulatory review perspective, in terms of, I think we always need to come back and start with that definition of safety, reasonable certainty of no harm. But, this has been a long standing issue, right, in terms of evaluating those synergistic, even outside of infant, of various food components and ingredients. And I'm sort of a simple guy, but to me it comes back to those starting points, as to that definition of safety and suitability. Sorry, normally I talk really loud. Sorry. No, me, Barbara? Yeah, so no, again, I'll just briefly repeat. So again, I think synergistic effects are very challenging from that regulatory assessment standard, because of the nature of them and the complexity. So to me, where I always start from is going to that initial safety standard, reasonable certainty of no harm, and then juxtaposing that with suitability in the formula. So I think we always want to understand as best as we can those synergistic effects, but I think it can be, I think we can start slipping into precautionary principle thinking if we get overly wound up in terms of trying to define every synergistic effect in a very complex system outside of that safety and suitability framing.
Yeah, I think the thing we can have consensus on is that formula is never going to be 100% identical to human milk, right? And so there's going to be synergies and interaction effects that you can best approximate based on what you know about the individual ingredients that are going into your formula. But, it's a reasonable certainty of what we think these things are doing in a formula matrix.
Now I would like to open up to the audience.
Yes, and thank you. Thank you for the great discussion already. If you think about criteria for inclusion, we've seen a statement in the introduction saying that our goal should be to make infant formula more similar to human milk, and to improve infant health outcomes. Now, I would propose these are two conflicting goals, and we need to prioritize. And my preference clearly is not to go for making infant formula as similar to human milk as possible, because we have seen already from your examples, Caspar, that this is mission impossible. We don't have one single human milk composition. We have examples that we all know where making formula as similar as possible to human milk would be not beneficial. If you just think of formula provided from 4 to 6 months onwards, follow-on formula, if you would make the follow-on formula similar to human milk in iron content, we would produce clearly an untoward effect. We wouldn't want to do that. And also, it's going to be extremely expensive to do so, and it would not be cost effective. And from my point of view as a pediatrician, I would like to have formula that is as beneficial as possible for as many infants as possible. It needs to be affordable. So we need to prioritize. And in my view, therefore, we should not start from human milk. We can learn a lot from the physiology of lactation. We can learn a lot from studying lactation and from understanding the physiology of breastfeeding. But my starting point clearly would be the infant health outcomes. We have a lot of differences between breastfed and non-breastfed populations in a variety of outcomes. And this is what, in my view, we need to prioritize if we want to improve infant formula, not to think about what is the next component in human milk, but what is the outcome that we can improve. And that should be really the priority, not to try to do both at the same time.
Thanks, very nice, especially also the affordability. I also want to say to the people online, please ask your questions in the Q&A. I will go first over there. Yes.
So thank you. And thank you for the discussion. I have 3 points I want to put into
Could you
the...
briefly introduce yourself?
Okay. Yeah, I'm Barbara Schneemann. I'm Professor Emeritus, UC Davis, formerly at FDA. And so just 3 points that I want to put into the discussion. One is a question of, and I think it's a question others have asked, is in looking at these particular ingredients as to whether or not they're suitable for human, for an infant formula, is it a matter of it's essential that they be found in human milk, but it's not sufficient to add them? I would be interested as to whether or not there's agreement on that kind of concept. I think the other thing that's inherent in these questions is that right now, FDA's primary way to look at safety of the overall formula is the growth monitoring study. And is the suitability of these ingredients going to be evident from that growth monitoring study? What other kind of test would be required? What other kind of thing? If it's not growth, what should be looked at? So that's another question. And then I'm actually going to build off of Tony's and say something that will get Paul upset at me, I'm sure. But I don't think of essential nutrients as suitable. That sounds too optional to me. I think of essential nutrients as essential nutrients, period. A functional ingredient could be suitable for infant formula. And Tony, I think your comments were hinting at that. How do we know when such a functional ingredient is in fact a suitable ingredient to add to infant formula? So just some other questions when you think about the regulatory challenge of putting these on the market.
Paul doesn't look too angry.
No, and I think your second question actually will come in a later session, Beck. So how should we test in different ways and only growth monitoring? So I think that question will be dealt with. But I don't know whether someone would like to respond to the first remark about the essentiality of it being in human milk. Yeah.
Can you repeat that first question?
It's more a question of, I say, is it essential that it be in human milk? It's something that we know about because of what's in human milk, but that by itself is not sufficient to justify its addition to an infant formula. Is that a fair statement? Is that something where there could be consensus?
That's consistent with what Dr. Kletzko was pointing out as well, that we're trying to emulate functionality of human milk, right? So, composition is something that is part of that thought process as you're trying to emulate functionality, but maybe the end goal, right, is more the function piece.
Yeah, and the level of evidence needed to get to that suitability and demonstration of functionality.
I suppose my only interjection would be, when you say essential, is that a bar against a potential ingredient that is not found in human milk?
I was mainly reflecting on those 3 categories.
Sure.
And so for the first one, suitable, I would just simply call those the essential nutrients, the things that we know
are necessary.
Yeah. And whereas to me, it's when does a functional ingredient, when does it at least meet the bar of being suitable to add to infant formula? And the question beyond that would be, at what point does it become essential?
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I mean, in nutrition, we think about essential nutrients as ones that cause a deficiency. So we have ingredients that don't necessarily cause a deficiency if they're not there, but we see better status in the formula-fed infant when they're added, thinking of DHA and ARA, for example, or even the carotenoids. So the baby can grow just fine without them. So they're not essential. There's no deficiency, but then there's still benefits. And there's an increase in status if they're added. So how do you categorize those, I guess?
So it's an interesting example because in the European legislation, DHA is essential. In the US legislation, it's optional.
And then we're going to introduce recommended and make it more complicated, right?
Yeah. That's a discussion we'll have in a few minutes.
Well, and there's a distinction there between essential and mandatory in that European example. In that case, are we really thinking about DHA as an essential nutrient, or is there just enough evidence that there was enough agreement that it should be a mandatory component? Maybe different words might be necessary if there's a lot of, if the word essential kind of evokes a lot of disagreement, and we feel like there's already kind of a definition for what essential is.
No? I was monitoring the number.
Yeah, I would like to maybe just add a few more comments. And Bert, I think we agree 100% in terms of, at least I focus on functional outcomes, because I agree we'll never be able to make human milk exactly, or infant formula exactly like human milk. We've talked a lot about synergistic effects, and I don't think we should assume that all interactions will be synergistic. Early in my career, I studied IGF-1 in milk. And if we start adding IGF-1 to infant formulas without the presence of IGF binding proteins, then we could actually, or different hormones in human milk may be acting to modulate their act. So it could be synergistic, additive, or actually potentially inhibitory. So if we broaden our thoughts around that. Another thing to add to, and kind of going back to Lindsay and nutrients, is also that even when we look at the nutrients that we've been adding to human milk, and Bert, this with the folate, that many of the nutrients are not in the forms that are present in breast milk. So I think there's the opportunity for narrowing that gap between, simply by re-examining not only what nutrient levels are appropriate, but what are the appropriate forms of those as well. I think that's all I had for now.
Bernd Stahl, Danone Research. Perhaps we can learn from the essential ingredients in human milk, which are defined for infant formula. Take proteins. There are bovine milk-based infant formula, plant-based infant formula, which have been shown in clinical studies that they result in adequate growth. Those components are, of course, not in human milk. Bovine protein is not in human milk, and plant protein as well not. So we do have this criteria that a formulation fulfills the adequate infant growth and development. If we move into other ingredients, and we saw on the list here lactoferrin, for example, there is bovine lactoferrin in small amounts in bovine milk. So that means infant formula standard composition will have traces of it. It is not the same like the lactoferrin we found in human milk. Caspar mentioned that, different glycosylation and so on. So we can add perhaps new functional ingredients which are not identical. I think Ashley mentioned that as well. We can add functional ingredients which are closer to human milk because of its structure and function, but they might be not always identical. I think it's the idea is to come as close as possible. If that we can do that on a single ingredient, of course the complexity can never be matched. I'm quite sure about that. But that means the moment we move from an essential ingredient into a functional one, we may have to consider then that we cannot match all the criteria of human milk, but we can come a little bit closer. And we see that same also on oligosaccharides with the example mentioned. So again, here it is a functional proxy. It is, if we are lucky, even a structural proxy. And for that, we need to analyze. And that perhaps adds two more parts of it. We have to understand human milk better. And I think Lindsay mentioned that we need big sample size. We need good analytical techniques to describe it. And it needs to be also done by validated method. So it's also a topic Lindsay mentioned several times. So we need to understand milk better. We can learn from macronutrients, and we can move functional ingredients, ideally in a composition which is identical to human milk, but we may have functional proxies which are not identical, which still do the job if proven by clinical studies.
So we have an online question that I wanted to share from Rob DiGregorio. He was asking, how does the concept of this improved outcomes as raised by Dr. Kletzko, how is that differing from the functional measures that we'll be discussing today?
You want to respond to that?
I don't think there is a fundamental difference. I mean, it all depends on what outcomes you're looking at. The point I was trying to make was not to go away from the functional outcomes or the clinical endpoints, but to say this is the priority, in my view, over mimicking human milk composition.
This is from Diana Orenstein, and she's asking a question to the panelists. I wonder if we need to reconsider what the definition of deficiency is in the population as we consider what an essential nutrient is. Could outcomes less than those observed in human milk be criteria for functional deficiency? Might we build a case that DHA is actually an essential nutrient in infancy?
I think it may be, yeah, Lindsay, if you have something to add, go ahead. But I think maybe we get into territory of really focusing on language, and language is really important, right? So I have a felt sense that trying to use the word essential for some of these components that we're talking about, some of these functional components might be a little hard for people to swallow, and maybe we need to put different language around that. Perhaps over time, you would generate enough evidence that you would truly believe that is essential. But still, I think language and definitions are important, and I think it's okay to have kind of multiple categories of components, and how we think about those components could differ a little bit.
And I think it's based on what is known by the scientific research at a given time, right? You may know your hypothesize that this component is doing something, but it might not be till decades later, like in the case of DHA, where the importance and essentiality of it really becomes fully recognized.
Maybe just a little bit of a historical perspective that, when we think about nutrient recommendations, a lot of it was driven initially by understanding vitamins as essential food components. And when the National Academy redid the framework for nutrient recommendations, it was trying to open up a framework that allowed us to think in terms of things that have a beneficial health effect, but may not follow the strict criteria of essentiality. Dietary fiber is an example of something that you recommend the intake, but it's not considered essential. And it's a struggle in nutrition. So it's not just for infant formula. It's a broader issue in nutrition of finding Where is that balance point?
Thanks.
And another example is vitamin D. We all know humans can synthesize vitamin D, even infants can synthesize vitamin D, yet the world agrees we should provide preformed vitamin D to babies with formula or supplements or both. So we wouldn't consider it an essential nutrient, but a required nutrient. So I agree with Ashley, the terminology is perhaps not the key question.
I see the Slido is on and working, and we already get answers coming in. So this is about one of the things we just discussed, whether a mechanistic understanding of a functional ingredient is important for selection of a candidate for addition to infant formula. And there seems to be a large majority saying that this should indeed be a prerequisite.
What if we put is a complete mechanistic understanding of
But what do you think scientists will ever say there's a complete mechanistic understanding?
I'm curious about like the 30% who say it's not a prerequisite for an infant formula ingredient.
So I'm going to add to this a little bit. Vanessa Castagna from Sipinion. I've been thinking about this as you're all talking about demonstrating function or mechanism or understanding some level of mechanism of action for these functional ingredients. But as we know, human milk components are not like this ingredient does this one thing. Every component of human milk is multifunctional. Let's take lactoferrin as an example. If this is true, and we as the scientific community agree that mechanism of action needs to be understood for each component, including lactoferrin, what mechanism of action? Which one? How do you make that determination? And even from a safety perspective or from a regulatory perspective, like how would regulatory bodies view a collection of evidence on maybe one function of a multifunctional ingredient? Like, do you need to have a collection of evidence of multiple functions of these multifunctional ingredients? It becomes very complex. So I'm just kind of curious how we're thinking about this demonstration of function.
I think that's a more elaborate version of what you just said, Tony, that a complete understanding is, of course, very difficult to achieve, I think.
Yeah, it was intended to be a little tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to add that, you know, at the end of the day, in terms of something being a prerequisite, I think that word was used, you know, then from a regulatory standpoint, you're wanting to understand, you know, the general physiological functions of that component and how that might drive the selection of further safety studies, right? And of course, you're going to want to build out your evidence on functionality, but like we've stated, that's kind of an evolving process. So, you know, more towards the beginning, the focus should really be on, you know, what's important to kind of further assess the safety piece. And I think probably panel 2 is going to get more to that this afternoon.
Thanks. I would also like to give Lindsay Allen the chance to respond. So please.
Yes, I just wanted to make the point that our methods for measuring mechanisms, the effective function, is still pretty crude, but they are improving really very fast. And so, for example, if we use metabolomics and various omic measures to look at effects on metabolism, I think that we'll see effects, whereas if we're just measuring growth as an outcome, we won't see any effect. We just have to, over time, accumulate much better evidence for how metabolism and various functions are being affected by these ingredients. The methods are developing, but looking at growth as a function is a very, very crude and simplistic way of measuring the actual effects of these ingredients.
Yes, thanks. Then if you have time, I would suggest that we move, because otherwise we just stick to only the first part of session 1 before lunch, and we have more sessions to be dealing with. So the next point to be discussed is something that was already brought up a bit, that you can have mandatory and optional ingredients. One of the suggestions that came from the survey actually is that there could also be a recommended category, which would be in between optional and mandatory ingredients. So do you agree with that, or do you disagree with that? And if you agree, under what conditions should this category exist?
I think Tony already said he did not agree, and I second his opinion, because I think it adds to the confusion to have a third category thrown in there, because what is then the difference between mandatory, recommended, and optional, when we also kind of don't know what's the difference between mandatory and optional?
I suppose where I come from, where my head goes, is more a practical view of what happens in the marketplace. If there is a scientific body or regulatory authority that says ingredient X is recommended in infant formula, who the heck is not going to put it in there? Really, I mean, that's to me where that is the point A to point B that comes with a term like recommended when you're talking about a critical sole source of nutrition in the most vulnerable population. What mom out there is going to say, well, FDA recommends it, but it's not in here? So I just think that is, we have to put a little bit of that practical framework and again, the importance of terminology and how that would work in practice.
The opposite would be true too. If it's not recommended, then no one's going to put it in there, and it won't be an optional ingredient anymore.
The other piece I'd like to point out is I think that there is a process for recommendation kind of baked into the overall framework. Typically before there's any kind of regulatory change or decision, there's often some kind of scientific consultation process. And I think that's kind of the opportunity for recommendations to be made. And then, separate to that, there are regulatory decisions that are made. So perhaps that recommendation piece falls more to kind of that expert opinion space, which is baked in. I think the other thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about recommendations is that there has to be enough science developed. It kind of has to be mature enough for experts to be able to look at it and feel like there's enough there to make recommendations as well. So there can be can take quite a long time to get to the point where you would actually have a recommendation that people feel comfortable standing behind.
But in that case, it would just move from optional to mandatory at some point. Or how do you see that?
I mean, we see that example with DHA. I feel like that one keeps coming up, right? But in some in expert opinions and even in some regulatory frameworks that is identified as an optional ingredient. And we saw the example in Europe where DHA was recommended to be included by EFSA, the expert body that informs the European Commission in making the regulatory standards, and it became a mandatory component of infant formula. After decades and decades of research, perhaps the panel felt like there was enough evidence there on which to make a decision at that point in time. So there are examples. It's just it is a lengthy process to get there.
Is there a differing opinion? Again, it came up enough to be
On here, yeah.
in the survey. I'm just
It's a differing opinion. It's to me, it's really a question of who's doing the recommending. Because I think, Tony, you hit the nail on the head. If FDA is doing the recommending, well, why is it not added? But there are other organizations that make recommendations that pediatricians may follow, or other influencers may follow. So I think, to me, that would be part of the question: who's doing the recommendation, and can there be a recommended category that's not necessarily handled through a regulatory path, but handled in some other way? And would that be acceptable, or is it suitable?
And my head kind of goes to some of the earlier remarks. Is the recommendation going to an expert committee that's doing an evaluation of the overall scientific evidence and taking that recommendation to ultimately make a decision? All right, we've answered this one. No problem.
I saw Doug take the microphone, so I thought maybe he wanted to make a comment here. So that was why I was.
Yeah, just bit jumping on Barbara's comment there. So what I think you were kind of implicating is to have the equivalent of an infant formula DRI to some extent, correct? Maybe, of what would be a recommended, maybe not a nutrient intake, but a recommended composition, and have a body that maybe is, endorsed or organized through National Academy of Science and Medicine that would provide that kind of guidance. Sorry, I'm Doug Byrne from the USDA, CNRC in Houston. Sorry.
Well, and I think Lindsay alluded to that also, that if you look at the DRIs, most of it is adequate intake. And can we get to a better place in terms of recommendations for infants? And if you look at the future directions report in the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee from the 2020 committee, and I'm positive it's there in the 2025 committee, updating the DRIs is a key recommendation for future needs. So, yeah.
Lindsay, you also wanted to chime in on this one.
Well, I would, of course, endorse that comment Barbara just made. We're not talking about amounts very much here. It's whether or not it should be has been the sort of thread of the conversation. But knowing how much is a really critical issue, and that's what the authoritative panels bodies do, is make a recommendation on how much should be added. On this particular issue here, if a constituent has a physiological effect, a benefit, why on earth would it ever be optional? And it shouldn't be there as optional if there is no effect. So I don't see why the optional category is useful.
I think I had a quick comment. I'm sorry, Claire Kruger, Spherix Consulting. In my mind, this morning's session is, should we add something? Is there something about the mechanism of action, about the functionality, that would be beneficial to improve what we consider to be a functional need for the infant right now who's on formula as opposed to human milk? This afternoon, we're going to talk about, is it going to be safe to do it? And I think once we answer those two questions and it actually goes into formula, we are decades away from should it be recommended? Because that's a lot of evidence that you have to compile, I think, to your point, for experts to feel that, you know, there's sufficient evidence that this is something that they should absolutely put in formula and recommended and or mandatory. So I think we're, you know, right now we're in the kind of the infancy of those questions, which is how do we get it into a place where we can then test it and test it in enough infants. You can't power a clinical study to do that. You have to have it out in the marketplace for a long time before you realize what it can do and then determine that it was actually an essential thing for formula.
Sharon Donovan, I guess this term conditional essentiality is something that we know that because of functional immaturity of enzymatic pathways in the infants that we could have so babies are not little adults, right? So and Bert knows the whole history of DHA probably the best, but this idea of when we start to see things in the serum be lower in breastfed infants, and particularly that decline, it's telling us, and this could be for specific amino acids as well. So I think we also have to look at it in the framework of this very specialized sole source nutrition and kind of considering from that perspective as well. But I agree that this is a very long-term process, but if we don't get started, we'll never get there, right? And even once we say it's essential, then there's a decade to be able to source the correct amounts that you can start to add to formulas. So this is why things have gone very slowly.
Hi, Marie Ryan from Oregon State. Just like to go on top of what you guys were saying, how can like academia, industry, and government all work like most efficiently to answer these questions?
That's a very general.
It is essential that I get some more coffee for that question.
So maybe I'll go back. So sorry, Paul Hanlon, Abbott Nutrition. So maybe I'll go back to the question I think Barbara brought up is who is making the recommendation? So would there be benefit to having a tripartite group that would get together and discuss? Right now, there are a lot of, I would say, optional ingredients. There are ingredients that may, by regulation, be added to infant formula that are not mandatory. So we flashed a bunch of them in my functional ingredient, everybody, functional ingredient category. DHA ARA is one of those examples in the United States. Still technically optional, recommended, yes, but optional. So I think where I think there's more room for us to discuss is what does that in between look like? So we know what essential or mandatory is. We know what that would pertain. I mean, that's in the regulation, but then is there some room for optional? I know I'm looking at Bert because of ESPGHAN. I mean, does ESPGHAN make recommendations for nutrients that aren't mandatory in the regulation?
Yes, ESPGHAN comes out with statements, perhaps not strictly recommending, but supporting certain components, right, or certain concepts. And I like this differentiation between recommendation, optional, being aware of the caveat that you raised, Barbara, which is an important one. But we see a lot of components where we think there's no harm and there's safety documented, but we don't see real indications that they make a big difference. And then there's components where there is consistent evidence from several clinical trials that they have a benefit. An example that comes to mind is the milk fats from MFGM, where we have a number of different studies which consistently show indications for benefit. Now, it's going to be difficult to make that a required ingredient because nobody really knows what is exactly the component that does the trick, and there's a variety of interventions that have been used, but still there's consistent indications for benefit. So that would be, for me, would be an example where an academic body or tripartite body could make a careful statement saying, we see there is consistent benefit. So it might be advisable to use these components preferentially when you choose an infant formula.
This is Barbara again. Okay, yeah. So to Paul's point, I would suggest that space, I like that idea of the space between an optional and essential, and maybe that's when an ingredient becomes suitable. It's not falling into either category. But I also want to point to another tension that sits with this whole area, which is, as Paul pointed out, an infant formula manufacturer is responsible to show the safety of the ingredients. They're not required to show the benefit, but these ingredients are being added because they have a potential benefit, and any company who adds them, in my experience, is going to make a claim about that. So that to me creates the tension in this whole area where a benefit is being claimed, but the only standard that FDA has to use is around the safety standard. So that's where some of the tension comes. You know, I know FDA has issued draft guidance on structure function claims, how you should substantiate. I don't know how much attention has been paid to them, but again, I don't have a resolution here, but it is one of the tensions that needs to be addressed, I think.
I think that's a fair point. And I mean, there is the standard of truthful and not misleading and when you get to an establishment claim, a structure function claim, right? It has to be based on the preponderance of the scientific evidence and ideally well-designed clinical studies with clear endpoints. And so, yeah, fair. But I suppose where my head was going a little bit on that question is, you know, in a tripartite setting like this, in terms of how are these, to me, this goes a bit to the resourcing and who is best at what, right? So within the academic research setting in academia, where there can be and should be that focus on sort of on some of those mechanistic issues, on that core science, and a little thing about funding, et cetera. But, you know, that aside, right, you know, and then on the industry piece, right, that, you know, I think, and Paul, I say this with love and respect, you know, there are areas where industry has, you know, very sophisticated and well-developed R&D programs and approaches. And I think part of this is figuring out how can that workload be, you know, best distributed in a way that supports sound regulatory science and decision making. So I know I didn't answer the question, but that's sort of the framework that sort of where my head goes.
And I guess to add to that, you know, research does not stop once something hits commercial market. You know, once an optional ingredient has been launched, research continues to take place. If anything, like it actually kind of exponentially increases because there's more interest now in that these things are actually in the marketplace. So we want to better understand, you know, if you can then eventually push it over into that mandatory threshold. But definitely, I like your thought process there on the resource. I mean, that's why we're all here, right? The tripartite aspect, because we're all looking at this from a slightly different angle and have different things to contribute to the process.
Thanks. The last question on this slide is actually something we already dealt with about the non-human versus human milk-like component. I just have one more slide of question I would like to do before we move. But can you help me? Yes. Before we move to the coffee break.
Thank you.
You- Yes. So this is about what we have been just discussing, whether we would need optional, mandatory, and or recommended category. So please go to the Slido and answer whether the it doesn't completely fit on the slide now.
This is Vanessa again from Side Opinion. I wanted to pose this as a framework question. So I know we're talking about, optional, recommended, mandatory per ingredient, but what does this panel and audience think about shifting it to like functional outcomes? Because it seems like that's where a lot of people are landing on selecting ingredients for including in infant formula. So instead of saying what's the threshold of evidence needed for, I'll just continuously use lactoferrin since that's my background, but for lactoferrin as a, moving from an optional ingredient to a recommended, what about framing it as an antimicrobial protein or an antimicrobial component to improve the outcome of, upper respiratory infections or something where you're actually going backwards, right? You're looking at what is the functional outcome we're trying to change. And can you make that as a category of ingredients that would then be recommended? Like, moving backwards instead of forwards, or moving from top down instead of from bottom up. It's just a different way of thinking.
Are you looking at specific disease state or high risk populations like NICU, supplementation?
Let's just keep it easy with healthy term infants. Easy. And Dennis just arrived from former CIFSTAN here, so I'm going to poke at him too if you have any thoughts on this.
No pressure, Dennis.
I've never seen a mic I didn't like. I think of this from a food additives perspective, and working in the food additives program for 30 plus years. Now, the Food Additives Amendment was passed in 1958. The fundamental aspects of that amendment have not really changed since then. And it has served very well in terms of ingredient safety. That's not to say that FDA's interpretation or application of the Act has not changed. I mean, the fundamental definition of a food additive, which is where the GRAS exemption lies, is in that 58 Act. That 58 Act and that GRAS exemption has been interpreted and reapplied by the agency in many different ways. In the early 90s, when I first came to FDA, it was used to establish the voluntary consultation program for biotech plants. In the late 90s, with the food contact materials, because the food additive definition applies to food contact materials, the statute was changed explicitly to create a carve-out for food contact materials. But since then, also at around that same time, FDA's interpretation of the GRAS provision shifted from requiring a GRAS affirmation petition, which was very similar to the food additives petition process involving the Federal Register, it was a voluntary program, to a voluntary notification program, which really enhanced the ability for the agency to respond in a timely manner to innovative ingredients that were safe, that were generally recognized as safe. That provision was also used to create the voluntary notification program for foods derived from cell-cultured meats. So the Act has been very helpful and useful, and it's the reinterpretation of that fundamental Act that has been beneficial, and the agency has adapted to it. And I sit here and I think, well, okay, that served us well, but now at this point in our state of knowledge, we're coming across concerns about ultra-processed foods, however you want to define that. The way, how can the Act deal with these substances that potentially they're from a toxicological perspective when they first were approved. They're now being considered to be causing adverse effects that would never have been detected in a pre-market scenario. They required epidemiology studies, post-market entry to address. So I'm wondering, I'm thinking out loud here, and it just occurred to me last night, why isn't from a pre-market perspective the focus on safety first, consistent with the statutory requirements, and then benefits based on actual real post-market studies that actually document the conditions under which the benefits occur, and not force yourself into a situation where you're driving the science pre-market to convince the regulators that yes, indeed, there is a benefit. Why not just keep it simple, say focus on safety, and then post-market think about justifying the benefits or any claims that might be provided to you. And those are my 2 cents, and that's all I'm going to say.
That is not all you're going to say. But I think it's a really interesting, and it was alluded to earlier in terms of intake and consumption rates. I read your Kessler petition comments; they were very good, Dennis. But you know, it sets up this larger question, right? We have a standard for safety, right, which is for a particular intended use, right? And then we're talking, so within, I won't use that. I don't like that UPF term. I think it's inflammatory. Paul and I have a lot of things we don't like, and we're going to complain about them today. But you know, when you look at some of the discussion points around that, it's someone ate an entire bag of potato chips in one sitting, right? So, and that intake rates, how does that get framed into a assessment of reasonable certainty of no harm for an intended use? So it's, sorry, I'll step down from my soapbox now.
I think this is why we're all here as well, because you know, what is safety in the context of an infant formula ingredient? You know, is it, and what is an adverse event? Is it something that's overt and can be clearly seen in a clinical study, or is it something more nuanced where somewhere down the line there might be some sort of abnormality or outside of the range of normal that happens, and we're maybe starting to encroach on the precautionary type of principle where you're requiring an absolute certainty of no harm because we don't know what these things are doing and therefore they are not safe, and bringing that back to a reasonable certainty of no harm standard.
Thanks, everyone. I would say we break now for a coffee. Before we go to the second topic of levels, I wanted to come back to the 3 main consensus targets that were formulated beforehand. So the first is about the scientific criteria for selection of functional components and whether they should differ between human milk and non-human milk similar components. I think everyone agrees that you need this stepwise approach from understanding mechanism, preclinical up to clinical data, and that does not really differ between components present or not present in human milk, because it's the functionality that we need to be aware of. We need to understand mechanistically to some extent what is happening, although full mechanistic understanding of all the different functionalities that a single component may have may be too hard to achieve, but at least some understanding would be required. When it comes to our recommended category next to the optional and mandatory, I find it difficult whether we reach consensus. I don't think we did, because even during the coffee break, I heard different opinions on that one, but that's fine as well. I mean, we don't need to reach consensus on every single topic we are discussing today. Then we will move to the second set of questions, which is related not so much anymore to which components to add to infant formula, but how much should we add? So at what level should we add ingredients, and what the role of human milk is in that? What's the role of human milk, and how do we deal with variability in human milk? That are the two main topics for consensus. So again, we have a number of questions that I would like to first ask you and then ask the audience to respond to. And the first one is about how to use human milk data in view of variability. Variability was already mentioned several times. Lindsay already explained her perspective also from her experience in micronutrients earlier. So there's a lot of different reasons that milk composition can vary. So how should we take that into account if we look from the perspective of infant formula?
Yeah, so I think, you're always looking at the totality of evidence that you have available to you at a point in time, right? Often human milk is a starting point for thinking about what might be an appropriate target. You kind of recognize that your human milk data might not be perfect and it might not answer all the questions, but like I said, you're kind of working with what is known at that moment. And I think you're wanting to understand ultimately, if you can, like what's driving some of that variability, right? So, you obviously see ranges in human milk composition. You might want to understand, for example, I know I keep using like DHA as an example, but we see DHA present in milk in all human milk, but it tends to be quite low when like maternal dietary intake is very low. And we can see it going up to quite high levels. So I think, kind of that understanding of what might be driving the different variants in composition, can help point you toward, picking a certain target within that range. And sometimes you don't have all the information either. And you're maybe just trying to hit a mean as a starting point. But again, I think you're kind of working with all of the evidence that you have available to kind of understand what's driving that composition.
I think with infant formula, the composition and the levels that are in formula products are always going to be static. Like that's just the reality, right? Whereas human milk is definitely not a static situation. So we can only best approximate using human milk as a data, and where it makes sense to do so, set some target level based on.
Can you speak closer to the microphone?
There's an air conditioner back there that's blowing, so we really can't hear you guys much. That's what it is. It's not that you're not talking loud, there's some sound interference back there.
Yeah, noted. So I'm not sure how much of that you caught, but I was just saying that infant formula composition and use levels in a formula product is always going to be static. That's just the nature of how it is. And human milk is obviously not static. So it's making a best guess of what is the appropriate level for inclusion based on the weight of evidence and what you know about the nature of the substance, how it's going to act, and what is an appropriate level.
We're the biostatisticians in the room. I mean, but half a joke, but half serious, right? I mean, it depends on how much data do we have looking, and I think Lindsay might be wanting to chime in here too, because I think this gets to some of her earlier comments in terms of what does that overall data picture look like, and where does the data lead in terms of how we talk about setting a target level, knowing that there is significant variation that can happen within the population.
Yeah, we know, I think, very little about what causes variation in most milk components. For some, like some nutrients, it's maternal diet. For some, it's maternal genetics, B12, folate, and certainly HMOs and other constituents. But that variability is a real thing, and we have to cover that. And so I think there's becoming enough data that now we could figure out what sample size is needed to get an average, a 50th percentile level on many of these milk constituents. My guess is 100, 200 people, somewhere in that range. And then you have to add on to that probably 2 standard deviations, which is what we've traditionally done for nutrients, so that it's safe, but a low % of people, of the infants, will get intakes less than the 50th percentile of the population. I do believe harmonization is possible. That was a question I was asked to comment on. I believe harmonization should be the goal across countries, across the world. We haven't seen very much difference among women in 4 very different study sites: Latin America, Bangladesh, Denmark, Gambia, and so on, except in a few milk constituents. So I guess the bottom line is we have to understand how many women are needed in order to account for the variability, which is definitely there and should be covered. But this can be done, I believe. The question also is linked to levels that we could believe could offer human milk-like outcomes. So this very much also includes this concept of what are the human milk-like outcomes. Are we down to the level of looking at metabolomics, different immune functions? All those different outcomes have to be included in this consideration. But to start with, yes, designing studies can be done, I believe, and account for the variability in milk constituents.
Yeah, so Lindsay, maybe to add on, I think all those comments are in line with what I was thinking too. So maybe also going back to something you said previously. So I think you could take 2 approaches. You could take an approach where you evaluate every single ingredient individually and say, this is the data set we need to establish what normal is. Or I think there's an option where you could set up criteria for, here is the number of data points that you need, here is the number of points during lactation that should be sampled, and like have a more systematic approach that then you could apply to any component of human milk. So if doesn't matter what your component is, as long as you do 200 samples at 1 month, 2 month, 4 month, etc. I'm also not the biostatistician, but I think coming up, because there are so many components in human milk, if we can agree on what that criteria is, I think that would help us out moving forward.
And then with these levels, you can use them in different ways, because in the end, we talk a lot about safety. So you have a certain level at which a component may be present that is safe. Also, you would like to have some functionality from your functional components. And these levels, of course, will probably differ. So how should that be taken into account? Because now for mandatory components, we describe how much should be added. For optional components, there's just a maximum safe limit. So how should we deal with that in the context of functional components?
Well, I think, when we're talking about those essential components, there really is a function that you're trying to meet there, right? That you're trying to prevent deficiency, right? So I think we have to kind of go back to the kind of frameworks that are in place, and that is like a part of a safety determination, right? Ultimately, you need those components to be there for adequate growth and development, right? When we're thinking about these essential components, these kind of functional components, we are, first kind of thinking through the safety piece, right? And that's the piece we have to demonstrate. So that is a starting point for the thought process.
I'm fully caffeinated now. So I will, on this question here too, I want to take a slight diversion. Effective dose really stands out to me in that question. And I want to be somewhat cautious when we are, and again, I don't want to step on particular nomenclature, but again, to your point on the safety standard, right? When we are talking about safety versus in a pharmaceutical context where your analysis is safe and effective, right? So you're doing a risk-benefit analysis on a substance that is intended to address a disease state specifically. So, minimum observable dose or minimum, let's say for a mandatory ingredient, minimum required dose versus the maximum tolerable dose. And I think we want to be careful here when we are talking about functional ingredients that we don't start mixing our nutrition with medicine. And again, with all deference to my friends at Tufts, I think the whole food is medicine concept is a terrible public policy. But Paul's telling me to stop talking now. But yeah, I don't think that was intentional, but this was a good opportunity for some caffeinated preaching. But again, I think it's a point we need to maintain throughout this discussion.
Yeah. We had a question from online, and just was going to, Mankey, you had moved past the whole static infant formula, but we had a question about thinking about staging and whether that's feasible and what the thoughts in the room are about that opportunity to. Levels are so important, and we know that they're very dynamic over lactation for some nutrients. So what would you say, or others in the room?
Yeah, some jurisdictions certainly do have staged formulas and composition requirements that are different across those 0 to 6 months formula versus 6 months plus, or whatever the classification happens to be. And that is why they are staged, because some of the nutrient requirements are slightly different. But back to this question about the minimum dose. And is that something that should be implemented for an optional ingredient? I guess there's different ways to look at it, right? From the policy perspective, where FDA in some other jurisdictions only look at safety, and suitability and all those things are kind of like an aside. But there is maybe something to be said about that to ensure claims that are being made for certain things after they are commercialized are actually substantiated. And then I also kind of struggle with, what is an effective dose? What is the endpoint that is considered effective? Is it a shift in microbiome profile closer to what you see in a breastfed infant? Is it changes in stooling pattern? Is it something to do with their risk of an immune infection? Those are all very different efficacy dosages, perhaps even, and that makes it a little complex to try to set that in a regulatory policy framework.
But if you try to look at one specific example, for example, HMOs, you can say how much HMOs which are now available should we add to infant formula? We can say we just know that this is a safe level, so we should just set a safe level, but then everything below that should be fine. Or because in the end, if we just add such small quantities that it doesn't do anything, you can mention on your package this contains this HMO. So how to deal with that in, for example, this example?
It comes back to everything you claim must be truthful and not misleading, right? So
As your attorney, I advise you don't answer that question.
there is a certain responsibility that companies have to take into, be responsible for when they decide to make these claims and when they're formulating their products and making sure that what they're putting in there and what they're claiming actually are supported by good scientific evidence.
I think we see that framework globally as well. If you think about places where there is an optional ingredient category, there's not typically a minimum set, but there is a maximum set that's more of a safety related parameter, right? And I think that it may reflect just the nature of these components. It may reflect also just where we are in our scientific understanding of these components. There may not be enough evidence to set that minimum level. And so, the foundational piece to establish is safety before we can get to that next level if you do get to that point.
So I had a quick question for the panel, because this comes up in discussions with FDA. They talk about safety, but they also talk about the word appropriate. So an appropriate level, not an effective level, but an appropriate level. And typically they default to a mean concentration, which of course, milk is varying over days and people and whatever. But the mean concentration is one for which they have a comfort level. But by definition, it means half of the babies are getting less than they need and half of them are getting too much. So what is it about the mean that is appropriate or not? And is there, if one could identify and document the safety of a higher level, and I think it goes to what Lindsay was saying, that many times we give a little bit more to make sure that there's no deficiency in the intake of a particular ingredient by infants. What percent of a 90th percentile, which is usually what we use, we support safety of the 90th percentile. Is there a better way to look at how to choose the level based on the analysis of amounts in human milk?
Data, clinical data, for instance, if you now test it above your mean and you have clinical data to suggest it's safe, that should be part of that weight of evidence approach. It's not just for optional ingredients too, though, right? Like it's for all the nutrients too that are going into formula products. What are you using as your reference in setting your target level for inclusion? And it continues to change over time too as science evolves. Like people are continually reassessing even the mandatory components in formula. What is appropriate? What is safe? What is essential?
There's a question in the back, I think, or not?
I had a comment. Was it?
Okay.
My name is Jody Butler. I'm from Nestle Nutrition. I keep thinking of comments, but they're more towards the clinical piece, so I've been hesitant to bring them up, but one keeps coming in my mind. I think when you talk about safety of an ingredient that's functional, I'm just not sure growth we're not saying it's there for growth, we're saying it's there for something other than growth. So that is a big question. And then when you try to talk about what's minimally efficacious and who the comparator is, I don't think we even know about how these ingredients work in human milk. We can't do cause and effect studies for human milk, so we really know very little about what that specific ingredient is doing in an infant because it's part of a mix. So that goes on in my head when we talk about safety. There's another. And I also think in other parts of the world, suitability is a minimum benefit. So in other regulatory environments, you have to show something other than growth, a minimum benefit. And it's becoming more common. And And also with the maximum dose, other regulatory bodies are also starting to require a minimum effective dose. I think it's happened recently in China with HMO approvals. So it is starting to shift, but I think once you say you have to do that, it's very complicated, I think, in determining how you assess safety of functional ingredients and even what would be minimally effective. So it's not a question, it's just I think this is very complicated nuances, and I just wanted to share some of the complexity.
Thanks. Ben.
Bernd Stahl, Danone Research. So we do have an example on prebiotics in Europe, also checked by EFSA. There's the maximum level of prebiotics given, like 8 gram per 100 ml, 8 gram per liter. And this was based on studies, and this is the upper level. It is an allowed ingredient, so it's an optional ingredient. It's not an obligation to use it. So therefore, the safety point is the most relevant one. And for the prebiotics, I think we would have not growth as general parameters. Of course, the babies need to grow and develop accordingly, but the prebiotic concept is just to stimulate the microbiota, which is an extra benefit, so to say, not just growth and development. It's of course related, but the main intention of prebiotics is support the microbiota in the right way. So what we see as a practical consequence, an upper level, which was based on clinical studies, have been used as a kind of guideline how much maximally could be used. And there's, according to my information, no lower limit given. That depends then on clinical studies to show that lower limit of a different compound can also do a similar effect.
What should that be defined, a lower limit?
I think we just heard it also in Asia. We see that there's a discussion about a lower level, which needs to be reached even. So, but I'm not aware that we do that in Europe or have seen that in Europe so far.
No, I'm not saying whether it, but should it be there? That's
Well, there is obviously an argument for defining a minimum effective dose. I remember the times when people started to add DHA to formula, and they had 0.1% of the fat as DHA in the formula, and then they claimed now with DHA, which in my view didn't make any sense because nobody has seen any biological effect at that level. So in a way, it's a little bit misleading even. So if we base addition of ingredients on function, then clearly we need to look at what levels show a functional effect, what is the range that we would like to approach to achieve that effect. And that could be an adequate range, not one level, but rather a range probably for most substances. And if you start from human milk, the range of human milk would be sort of a guidance from where do you start. But it's a very weak basis to say the target levels should be based on human milk data, either median or mean, probably more median than mean, or median plus 2SD or whatever, is only a substitute for ignorance if we don't have data on what really the effects are.
Yes.
Just a comment on some of the things that have been discussed. With regard to staging, the standard in the US is that if it's for 0 to 12 months, it's an infant formula, and it has to meet the infant formula standard. I know that varies among countries, and it could be another thing that maybe we didn't get it right. It's always fair to ask that question. And I want to emphasize what Tony was saying about drug. Be careful if you walk down that pathway, because probably the most common warning letter from FDA is you have an unapproved new drug. So, you know, I understand the terminology, what you're trying to get at, but I'm wondering if that's when something like the adequate daily intake, the adequate intake sort of created by the national academies to look at ingredients who don't fall into the standard essential category, but sort of help us think about, what would be an adequate intake for a perceived effect. And just another observation, for the 2020 Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, we were initially told not to use the breast milk data that USDA had because they regarded it as so out of date. And I know the work that Lindsay's doing is having an impact in this area, but hopefully we will have something that we can use for the dietary guidelines. And I don't know if our USDA colleagues want to comment on that or not.
Well, I can, Lindsay, I can say that we're using the AI for nutrients now, and those AIs are many of them are wrong, but we're getting along, we're surviving, but even those need to be revised.
And I'll just make a plug for Lindsay's data. You know, part of the problem in the past has been the limitations of the data that's out there. And the data that was just published and is still being published from the MILQ study really is the best data out there to really understand the variability in nutrients in human milk.
But then the last question is actually looking at variability from a more positive angle, because you could also say, we know how much variation there is. We can also use that because, as just said, we have a range that exists in human milk. So should we not just design our studies, and that will also be discussed in session 2 this afternoon and session 3 tomorrow morning. So should we use the human milk range as a starting point to have multiple levels for further testing?
I do think that, I mean, it's all part of the totality of evidence you'd be considering as you're kind of putting together your starting points, right? I think people have mentioned it's not the only thing we're going to be looking at, but it is certainly a piece of the puzzle that should be taken into consideration, right?
Then we have a next Slido question. So when using human milk data to set a target level for a formula ingredient, how should we handle variability? And a number of options are given here, maybe not enough options. We will see. But please fill in this Slido question to see how you feel about using human milk data. Or the last answer option, do not use human milk composition directly at all. Because that's, of course,
I feel like Slido should have the capability to give us the statistical strength of these bar lines.
I just already heard the reason why to use median values to, but the most answered option is stratify data by relevant factors. Someone wants to comment on that and which factors they feel are important if you want to do this.
So Casper, maybe I'll start it off. So I think I picked that one partly because I think that maybe some additional context is needed in the question. So if you're talking about safety, I think you could make a strong argument that you could use, like Claire said before, like a 90th percentile or something near the top. If you're talking about trying to set a target to ensure providing a function, then you may want to look at a different value. So the context of why you're establishing a target, I think probably informs how I would answer that question.
And maybe I could add just probably that's true for most of the poll questions that have gone up today, probably that context would be helpful to kind of overlay. That might shift the consensus in one direction or another across the board.
To quickly add on that, one thing that we've been talking about DHA as our poster child, but one of the HMOs, 2FL, and there are other HMOs as well, some lactating people just don't make it. So I, as the resident biostatistics, not biostatistician person in my group, I love the idea of using medians. But if you use the median for 2FL, like some people don't make it. So is it safe for a infant born to a lactating person who does not make 2FL? Is it safe for them to have an infant formula that contains 2FL or to get donor milk that contains 2FL? I feel like these are questions that are usually not discussed because we just assume donor milk must be safe. So this isn't exactly an answer, but it explained my non-anonymous answer to this quiz question. Oh, and I'm Jen Simmons from Spherix, by the way.
Jen, I think you raised an interesting point, and it's something that certainly has been discussed as well. But it comes back to functionality, right? 2FL is not the only HMO in there. It's being used as a surrogate for the 200 plus HMO structures that is in human milk. And when you think about what happened before HMOs were commercialized and it was possible to produce HMOs, GOS were used, and they also hit, the total oligosaccharide content. So I think it's really case by case and depending on your substance as well.
Yeah, I was going to have a comment about that. So when I think about this question, I think about, well, you look at the minimum and maximum ranges that are in human milk across lactation, and that would seem like a reasonable range to consider. But if you look at factors, and many of these factors that are functional tend to be more enriched early in lactation and colostrum. So if you say, okay, that's the upper limit, that might be one of the mitigating or considerations in terms of how you would decide what level of, just say lactoferrin to put in a formula. Do you put in the level that's present in early colostrum or the first 2 weeks of milk, or do you consider the amount of lactoferrin that's in there at 3 months of lactation? So I think there are some circumstances where you might want to make these considerations of where a higher or a lower level of a given functional ingredient might be more appropriate or suitable. I'll stick to the words.
Hi all, this is Dave Dallas. I was just thinking that perhaps using the human milk as a model doesn't always make sense, right? Because there are different components that may have lower absorption rates from formula, like when carotenoids are put into formula, they have to be put in at higher levels than they would be present in human milk to have the same effect. So maybe this point about matching human milk may not fully make sense, and maybe it goes back to what Bert was saying about focusing on like the functional outcome instead. That's my comment. Yeah.
Now the consensus question before we move to the next topic. So if we look at human milk concentration, I don't think they should be. They are just a starting point, an ignorant starting point, as what was mentioned here, but they should not be the final answer. And variability helps in understanding what ranges exist, and let's say also what ranges could be tested, but it's in the end not the final answer to how much should be added to infant formula. Then we move to the third topic of this first session, which is going a bit more technical in the components themselves. because as I already explained in the introduction, structures may be different. We have components that are really identical to human milk. We have components that are structurally similar but not the same. And how well should they be tested? How similar should they be? So that's what we are going to discuss in this last part of session 1. And again, we have a number of questions that I would like to first discuss with the panel and then also get the audience input on. And the first one is about the analytical side of this. So how much should we already characterize a component prior to further testing? So should we know in detail? I mean, we can, if we take a protein as an example, you can look at the amino acids, you can look at the glycosylase, you can look at the structures, but there are already for a single component different levels at which you can look at this. How much should we know about a component before we start further testing it?
Well, I think maybe much like kind of human milk discussion that we've just had, where we're kind of thinking about it as a starting point. Again, I think the analytical work provides some starting point. And again, I think it depends on what your goal is. You know, again, if we are tasked with assessing safety, then you know, you're going to want to do some structural characterization to maybe understand if that contributes to understanding kind of the potential physiological functions of that ingredient and how it might contribute to designing kind of follow-on, you know, safety assessments, you know, starting with preclinical perhaps. So I think you could potentially go down a rabbit hole where there's kind of no end to the assessment that you do, and you know, you kind of want to think about, is it helping me make the next decision that I need to make in terms of like designing a follow-up trial.
I'm going to look at this from a regulatory submission standpoint. Like, I actually think it's not an or here in that question 1. You absolutely have to characterize the ingredient that you're producing. You have to know what its sequence is and how the glycosylation pattern varies, and if you can actually produce this consistently. So that's part of your identity characterization in any regulatory submission. Now, the second part of that question is, do those differences matter from a functional standpoint and from a safety standpoint?
I kind of always go, I think about enzymes, right? You have to, those binding sites need to be highly conserved, but the rest of that giant protein you can schmutz around with. That's a legal term.
But a component I always find very interesting in this aspect is MFGM, because MFGM is like it's a structure, it's composed of multiple components. So, I mean, if you look at a single protein, then you could still say you need to characterize what you have. But how can you deal with that from the framework of something that is a more complex ingredient?
Do we have any MFGM manufacturers here?
So I'm not an MFGM manufacturer, but I'll wade in anyway. So I think maybe it comes back to functional too. So we spend a lot of time about characterizing it, which I agree is very critical for understanding any ingredient. But if you have something like MFGM, it's, you know, I'll go back to the European guidance, which I think has a really helpful term, which is characteristic component. So if you establish a specification in characteristic components and you have a manufacturing process that can maintain a certain level of that characteristic component, you can have good confidence that the rest of the ingredient would be relatively similar. So you have stable manufacturing, you're consistently producing something with control of a characteristic component. How important is it that you know 100%, you know, composition? I think you can make a pretty strong argument that it isn't that important, especially if you can demonstrate that whatever function you're getting out of it can be maintained as long as you're maintaining the characteristic component.
I was going to say there's a very good example of how FDA dealt with that for a food additive. It was glycerol ester of gum rosin, which is very complex. And the strategy was to bridge safety data to something else very similar to it. And what FDA opined on was that if you are qualitatively equivalent, you can absorb quantitative differences so long as they're not toxicologically relevant. So it's really controlling the characteristic components and understanding that batch to batch to batch, whether or not you've identified 1,000 different things in there, that qualitatively it stayed the same, and any quantitative variability was not of physiologic or toxicological relevance. And so I think that's a good way to look at very complicated things like MFGM.
And then if we look for structurally similar components, what type of studies would you need to do to demonstrate functional similarity? Because we already hear several times that in the end, functional similarity is more important than that you have precisely the same structure. How should that be tested? What would be things you would need to do?
Yeah, I guess the struggle with this one is there's maybe not a requirement to demonstrate functional similarity, although there may be desire to try to emulate the functionality of human milk, right? So I think we don't necessarily need to be so, I don't know that we have to have completely different thought processes for these kind of buckets that I kind of see in some of the questions where we're sort of saying, well, this component's very different from human milk. Should we have a different thought process for it? I think there's probably like an overall framework that we want to kind of think through that is flexible to be able to think through multiple different types of ingredients.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think the case by case term keeps coming up, but I think it's case by case on what your substance is and what you're talking about and what the predicted functionalities are. So just looking back at GOS-FOS, for instance, they were added to formula to replicate the prebiotic fraction in human milk. I mean, GOS and FOS are not in human milk for sure, but they're replicating that function. And so the study types that are done are related to endpoints related to the prebiotic properties. And you could argue the same for the cow milk derived proteins being used to replicate the human version of that protein in human milk. And then you have to go through the thought process of, well, which studies are then appropriate for that type of substance.
Tim Lambers from Friesland Campina. I was actually thinking about this sort of in the perspective, what type of ingredients do we now see in this field? And that's, I think, a distinction you definitely have to make, because if you're talking about proteins, functional proteins, it may be a completely different story than for thinking about the prebiotics. And I always like the simple things. So a direct comparison to human milk is I think, a very good way to convince maybe people. Is it sufficient? No, but that's maybe in practice what we do nowadays. So whether we should go beyond that, I question it.
Bernd Steider, non-research. I would like to build on two examples, one from Tony on the enzymes and one from you on the prebiotics versus HMS. I think it depends always on the intended reaction or function. So if on the prebiotics and HMS, if the intention is to be anti-infective by lowering the pH. That can be done by several different prebiotics. So it can be done by Gosfors or others. If the intention is to mimic a pathogenic receptor, you need a specific structure, maybe 2FL, 3FL, or SLs. So the moment you talk about this function, then the structure matters. It's like this enzyme example. So I think always answering the question, what is the intended use of it? And then you need to match the structure as close as possible, or you match features of that molecule which helps you to get to the biological function. So I think therefore the proxy of enzymes or antibodies or receptor ligands matters a lot, and perhaps then the rest doesn't matter. And if it's a more general approach, like lowering pH, you can do it with multiple components. So.
Yeah, it comes back to the earlier comment that, you know, these things are not just doing one thing. It's a concerted, complex, interconnected, you know, impact on the biological system. I mean, but, you know, when we're, from a practical matter, when we're doing studies, you try to pick one endpoint to study, right? And either preclinical or even clinical study, there's only so much you can look at a given experiment.
And from that perspective, we could even say the more mechanistic understanding we have, the more complicated we also make it for ourselves, because we want to go towards an even more specific goal. But that's there was a question in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that if in fact the object of adding the ingredient is to make a claim, if that's going to be one of the outcomes, then to stay truthful and not misleading, you should make sure that that ingredient has the purported effect.
I'm going to get in trouble with the toxicologist, but it also, in my mind, I mean, there's some, to your point, I think there's, my head's going to the Kramer classification system, which I know is not what we're focusing on here, but when we're talking about functional attributes and structure, right, is, you know, what are the buckets that are at play? And how can we translate that and understand them from a regulatory and safety perspective?
And then maybe when looking at the last question, I mean, earlier you said we should not go down the rabbit hole of trying to analyze everything, but how far should we go? So, of course, we cannot analyze everything, but what would be the minimum that you would like to know?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of want to restate what I said before, and some of the other comments that have been made. It kind of depends what your goal is, right? So you're, you know, you're using that analytical characterization as a tool, right, to inform your next steps in terms of what further evidence you want to generate. It's not, you know, kind of the piece around human milk composition and the analytical piece is not the end piece that we're using, but it is like a part of the informative piece of the puzzle, right? So I think that's very case by case, because I think we're kind of talking in very general terms. It's hard to give really strong framework around that unless we like really, you know, narrow in on specific kind of case studies to work through, right? But yeah, there should be, it would be helpful to have like some bounds around what is needed.
Yeah, so that's kind of like the $1 million question, right? Like, how safe is safe enough? And, you know, I think there's, you know, you have to remember too, you know, it's risk is a judgment to some degree, right? And everybody has a different risk tolerance. And so maybe when I think about this, I see like almost two extremes. Like on one end of the spectrum is the, you know, a more liberal view where because it's in human milk, it's safe, and it's the, you know, safe until proven unsafe. And then on the other end of the extreme is that it's a conservative viewpoint that any unknowns is not acceptable, and we have to know, with absolute certainty that something is safe. So I think we need to land somewhere in the middle of that, and what that means and how that looks is probably going to depend on what your substance is and what what effects it could have.
How much money do you got?
How much money do I need?
I guess part of it is, if you're thinking about safety as, like, if you're trying to, like, sort of help inform your safety claim by saying, oh, this is something that is the same as what's already in human milk, therefore, we should have approval for it because it's, otherwise perceived as safe. That seems like it would require something to be exactly structurally identical, right? If that's the basis. But if that's not the basis and all the safety determination is based on separate kinds of testing that are not based on this, similarity to human milk, then I think it doesn't matter, basically. So it's like, I guess the question is, like, what are you using the similarity to human milk for in terms of making a regulatory, or like making a GRAS claim, right? Does that make sense?
It does, and I think Paul wants to, sorry. It also brings up this question of substantially equivalent, right? When you're looking at a particular substance where there might be a different production method, there might be, minor variate. We're talking about a protein. You have a few amino acid differences at one end or the other before you get that 3D structure. And, is that substantial equivalence in terms of the factors that you're looking at there, as opposed to exactly the same? Because I defer to the scientists again, but I don't think you have a lot of exactly the same out there in nature.
Yeah, so I'll just add, the infant formula ingredients have one benefit that other food ingredients don't have, which is we have a history of safe use for many of these components that goes back eons. And creating any safety package is always taking into account all available data. So if you do have that data, this exact same thing has been in human milk for thousands of years, I would consider that a pretty good data point to support the safety.
I'm just saying, but if that's only a good data point if it is identical in structure, right? Because any difference would make that not necessarily be the same, right?
I think then you would have to add in that rationale as to whatever those differences are they significant or not? So back to the enzyme example, if it's the active site that is changed, it's different, then you may have to provide additional rationale as to why that isn't consequential. But if it is part of the schmutzy part or whatever Tony said, like, maybe you can make the argument that, based on some study that we ran, like, that is inconsequential to the activity of the protein. Like, it would all go into that safety rationale.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, like, for example, if you have a recombinant protein and it's made in a different organism, then usually it has different glycosylation patterns, right? And so there are many possible, like, consequences of that change in structure that you may not be completely aware of, right? Like, maybe it doesn't change, like, the one particular function of interest, but it could change lots of other aspects of the structure. And so that in that case, it doesn't seem like the fact that that same protein is in human milk would actually make that compound with new glycosylation structures deemed safe. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, totally agree.
I was going to say, even if it's identical to what's in human milk, the question comes in that you have to address is that within human milk, it functioned in a matrix that's quite different than an infant formula matrix. And did that change its behavior? Was there something else in there that caused it to have a different function or a greater function or a lesser function now that you've taken it out and you've put it in a new matrix? And I think that it's just a question that's not necessarily so, but you have to address that question, I think, even if it's completely identical to what was in human milk, which is a very good starting point for safety, of course. But I think that's a question that FDA asks.
I was going to add to that, Doug Byrne from USDA in Houston. So on question 2, which I think that's kind of what we're still on here, I mean, many of these ingredients or proteins, even that can be made recombinantly now, in many cases can be very close to the bioidentical form that exists in human milk. So it seems like a lot of the studies to evaluate function of these ingredients or molecules are chemical, biochemical, and they can be done preclinically and wouldn't necessarily require clinical studies to evaluate function necessarily. And so it seems like that would cover many ingredients that are either already in human milk, or even in the case of some that are not currently present in human milk that we would claim to have a function of a molecule that it is in human milk, like GOS and FOS.
I'm Chao Wu from Humar. I just wonder whether this question can be expanded to the structural comparison to cow's milk, because cow's milk has been used in the infant formula for years and safety is proven. And even I'm thinking before people using cow's milk, and then maybe, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, people started using whey protein, which is from cow's milk. And I don't know, people know that part of history. Do the industry or the formula manufacturers need to prove the safety of the whey protein? And to what extent? Because you don't need to, prove the structure identity, right? It's from cow's milk. And what extent of the safety need to be validated?
Alpha-lactoalbumin went all the way through clinicals.
That goes back to the requirements for the growth monitoring study as well. So actually there's 2 things that you have to prove for the growth factor suitable for growth. One is protein quality. So you do have to run a protein quality study. We don't need to get into that here. And then the other one is a growth monitoring study. So if you did, I mean, we do have lots of infant clinical studies that have been conducted with whey proteins for sure that have shown that, as well as the protein quality part of it. So there is a requirement to look at those different milk protein fractions if you want to move to a completely casein-based formula. And there'd be an if those don't exist today, I'm just a toxicologist, but you would have to run some clinical studies to show that.
I wonder if I can ask a roadmap question from this. I know there's been attempts in the past, the FDA has convened a meeting talking about a lot of these issues and asking these questions to the scientists on post-translational modifications. How do you determine safety of these ingredients that have differences based on the production host or the technology that's being used to synthesize these ingredients? I guess I'm really more asking, what's the path forward? Like, what would this group of panelists or this audience recommend as, like, how do we as a scientific community or as a tripartite coalition go about answering these questions of demonstrating safety of ingredients that have shared structure but not identical? How do we answer these questions? Because we obviously can't answer them here. Dennis?
I think, sometimes, you need the kind of mandate to work that through, right? You're probably going to have to pressure test it with different examples and kind of have the the request in place to have a group of people kind of sit down and really actively evaluate that question, and maybe making sure that the scope of that question is narrow enough to get to an answer. I mean, I think here today we've touched on very broad topics to, should components be added to formula, to like, how do we get them in? We've kind of landed on that piece of do we need a recommendation? And I think sometimes that recommendation piece comes a little bit later in the process. There has to be enough data on which to base a recommendation. And so enabling that kind of generation of science up front to some extent kind of goes back to that safety question, right? Which is kind of the regulatory framework that's in place in the US right now. And so maybe that kind of narrowed in question is a good starting point on, are the processes in place sufficient? Do we need to build that out further? And exactly what does that look like as a starting point before you can kind of get to those questions of like, should this be added or not? But those are important questions, but that initial safety piece might need to be figured out to allow for the generation of more science to be able to answer some of those kind of should questions later on. So maybe just a way to kind of think about bucketing some of the broader, kind of covered quite a broad umbrella of topics today.
Yeah, and I would defer back to Dave's question earlier as to whether this question refers to suitability without considering safety. And at some point, I feel like there is a little bit of a overlap, and you could tease that apart further in session 2 of how you then separate safety from the suitability discussion. But I think the point that Vanessa, maybe you were getting at is that, yes, there may be some differences structurally from a recombinant protein versus the native version of that protein in human milk. Does that matter from a functional standpoint? Maybe they still have the functional outcome, but maybe it's not completely through the same mechanisms perhaps, or, like, do those differences, if they impact functionality, does that also then impact safety? Or if they don't impact functionality, does those differences also impact safety? And I don't know how to tease up. I'm not going to try, but I would defer to maybe the session 2 panelists to really tease those two concepts apart.
I would just observe one of the values I take from this whole discussion we've been having is I think the dilemma that FDA has been faced with is becoming clearer to people. And we all agree we need a solution. We need a way forward so that infant formula can be improved. But, they're not simple solutions under the current regulatory framework to figure out how to do that. So hopefully this coalition is going to come up with some good ideas.
I suppose I'll just add on to that I do think that the regulatory framework has flexibility, right? And the good folks at what was formerly known as OFAST, and I refuse to learn the new acronym, work really hard to be innovative from a regulatory science perspective within that framework. And the other piece I'd add on here is that hopefully the outcome here is to help build that assessment framework that can be viewed within the scope of that evaluation of general recognition of safety and a reasonable certainty of no harm, which is, I think, a really good safety standard, right? Because there's no such thing as absolute safety. There's no such thing as absolute zero, right? So I think working within that flexibility and arming the scientific community with that framework is hopefully where we lead.
No online questions? Lindsay.
Yeah, I'm asking myself, what are the functions, the physiological, biological functions that need to be improved for infant formula? It seems to me that would be a very important starting point. Is it just immunology, resistance from infection? Is it neurological? what do we know about the functions that need to be improved? And those should take the priority.
That's not an easy question to prioritize. Yes.
I also just wanted to make a point that so human milk is not necessarily the best, most perfect fluid, right? Like it has evolved as, you know, like it is providing sufficient advantages to make the species continue further, right? It's not perfect, right? It's what works. So it doesn't necessarily mean that human milk is necessarily like the best possible thing that could be created for infants. So it is also entirely possible to imagine that there could be ingredients that you could add that could enhance infant health outcomes beyond what's in human milk.
That's a very complicated statement, I think, and maybe we should have that as the final statement of this panel discussion, and we can chew on that over lunch.
That sounds more like a happy hour statement.
So when it comes to the consensus statement, I think in this part of the session compared to the others, the case by case has been mentioned several times. We cannot just say in general how much characterization we need. It depends on the component and what we want to achieve. And that although structural information is useful, in the end, it's the functional activity that is the most important, I would say. And with that, I would like to thank everyone, so both Lindsay online and the three panelists here at the table for being here this morning, discussing about all these difficult questions without us being able to provide only perfect answers. But I think that's was not to be expected. I also think it's a good starting point for the next two sessions. I think some of the questions that we have not yet been able to answer, I hope after session 2 and 3 we have some further answers. So thanks a lot for being here. And then I will try, and that's quite a challenge, to sum up a bit, because I've been listening, thinking, writing, and asking questions all at the same time. So if you don't agree with what I say, please come to me over lunch, and we can still fix it before we start writing the consensus paper after this workshop. So first of all, I think people do agree that mere presence in human milk is not a scientific justification for adding something to infant formula. In the end, it's one part. It may be the lazy part, just looking at what's in human milk and how much is in human milk, but at least it provides a starting point of what can be done. And if we then look at these components, the structural similarity of these components to human milk is something that we would like to know about, but it's more important that we are consistent in what we produce, and we know that it's functional, than that we aim at achieving identical components, because that is something we will probably never be able to achieve. And then if we look at levels, we always have the complexity of the variability in human milk. We can use it as a range within which we want to work. It also indicates how much variability there already is, and what we may want to use as a starting point. But it's again the lazy starting point and not the end point. Then I think for the binary, mandatory, optional categorization, or a multi-tier including recommended, I don't think we reach consensus. It may also depend on the specific viewpoint, whether you want this from a regulatory point of view, or that someone else is doing the recommendations, as was also brought up. And I think that's more or less what I took from this first session. Probably there is many more. I made many more notes than I now have been able to talk you through. But I would say that's a very fruitful first session. I'm also very happy with all the input from the audience. So thanks all, and enjoy your lunch, and we will be back at 10 minutes to 2.
2, yeah.
Okay, so enjoy your lunch.